Okay, what's your story, James?
Yeah, so a little about me before I got to Odyssey. So I grew up in Oklahoma. Oklahoma is split as far as economics are concerned. In the Oklahoma City area, there's the metro, and then there's your downtown, your Nichols Hills, like things of that nature. So I specifically live in the metro of Oklahoma City, which a part of it I talked about in that spoken word. It is kind of this middle ground between downtown, the capital, and kind of the mayor's house, stuff like that, and Nichols Hills, like the upper middle class type of thing. And so growing up, I lived in a very violent place. I was heavily influenced by that up until I was about 9, when my mom kind of forcefully took me out of that scenario. Um, Growing up prior to Odyssey, I ended up switching to online school to walk away from some of the bad influences that were around me. Moved to Midwest City, which is another city in Oklahoma. And during that period, got involved with sports, kind of started to build a confidence in who I was through that. Eventually switched from sports to academics once I was introduced into the idea that you could read books and it didn't cost money,
Hmm.
which is something that wasn't exposed to me. Free resources weren't necessarily free from where I was growing up. And so it was this huge expansion in what I could do that I didn't know was possible. I randomly found Odyssey I went to Epic Charter School, which is an online school, and they have this list of vendors that they can pay for you to go, like singing, football,
Oh,
tutors, things of that nature. And Odyssey was on there for some weird reason. And I thought it was like just a second school you go to, just extra learning type of thing. And so I went to Shadow, talked to Dr. Martin. Mr. Kruk, or Dr. Kruk, was a guest teacher on the day I visited there, and the next year he became an actual teacher. Um, and I just fell in love with the school.
hmm.
It wasn't something I had experienced before. It was really quirky and weird, and it wasn't your traditional experience. Um, and I looked back on the website, Odyssey disappeared like that from the list.
Oh,
So I'm
Really?
happy I found it at that point.
yeah,
Huh.
I think it was a mistake on their part for Odyssey to be there, but
yeah,
I'm happy it was.
yeah, yeah,
Wow.
yeah. Good question, Jane.
Oh, I was just asking James how he found Odyssey was different from the traditional school that he used to go to. Like, what were the kind of the main differences that you found?
I would say the product that they were offering was very different. Prior to Odyssey, I looked at Bishop McGuinness, which is a Catholic school. It was my first time. Like, we would barely be able to afford both schools because they were private. But I remember Bishop, they recruited me for athletics. They promised me, um, high academic achievement. You'll be able to get into college with us
Mhm.
out of the situation you're in. And Odyssey's marketing point wasn't necessarily academics, though they thrive heavily in that, and it's really challenging. Their main push and the thing that they focused on, despite all the other things that get talked about, was community.
Hmm.
I remember I shadowed a guy called Jacob Gunn. He's graduated now. And that was the most welcomed I had felt in a school setting, for
Really?
that to be my first day. And I had been in public school for years. And so, even in comparison to those years of experience, being in that setting was one of the most welcoming experiences I've had. And so, in my first introduction, the main difference that probably pushed me to even attend was that what they valued was different from any other school in the city, and I believe still is. It was community. It is community.
Hmm.
And so that's what pushed me to go there. And even furthering on to where I'm at now, I would have never gotten into any type of speaking if it wasn't for Sean Beckett. He left the school last year to do graduate studies at Boston U. But he's the one who pushed me. It was in a brain sciences class that he pushed me to do a speech. And then that next semester, he said, James, you have to do spoken word, get into it. Showed me all these different artists, Carvis Lassant, Joshua Bennett, and I just fell in love with it. And as he saw I began to get more interested into it, he kept pushing it, and just made it a fun experience to where I wanted to pursue it, and I did.
That's really cool.
It certainly is cool. I'm going to take you back a little because I'm curious about this. You mentioned that there were some difficult times until you were about 9, and there was violence. Can you give us a glimpse into that and how that manifested in your life?
So I grew up we lived in poverty, right? And so there was a lot of gang violence. I had family who were involved in gangs. I went to a charter school in the neighborhood, and so that area was also either the children, relatives of gang members, or actual gang members in themselves. And so surrounded by that environment, my ideal of the highest point I could reach was, I want to get into this life. There's a lot of benefits. This is what I want to do. And it got to a certain point to where, like, as a child, I wouldn't have minded risking my life for it. Dying at 18 was something that was just common. And so in my mindset, it was, I'm going to do this. I'm going to be great at it. And if I die at 18, I die at 18. Like, my value of life shifted. My paradigm was not what it is now. And the reason I say it stopped at 9 was, like, my mom had been struggling with trying to get me out of this life because that's not something she wanted to lose me to. Which I think that's honestly the mindset of every parent. It's just very hard to get a child out of that mindset once they're engrossed in the environment. But one of the biggest things that happened, she had, it had got to the point she had brought me to a juvenile detention center. And so she was going to do like they have, in America, there was this big show called Scared Straight. I don't know if it's still a thing or not, but this is before it became prominent. And so she was going to have me like be there for 3 days, like over the weekend, to experience it. And she just brought me there to meet the guard. And the guard, I don't know his name, and I wish I did because I would love to tell him thank you. He scared the life out of me. I mean, he brought fear in my heart I didn't know was possible. And I didn't even step into the facility. But once my mom told him the situation, he was straight up with me, and he was very direct, blunt, about what would happen. And in my mind, that didn't switch my behavior necessarily, but it did set me on a path to get out of that mindset. So that was kind of that situation, briefly explained.
Your mom sounds like an amazing woman.
Yeah, I'll say.
She is. She's about to get her first college degree at 44.
Get out. That is awesome. Can we interview her too?
Yeah, can you? The same thing. Get out, James. Get your mom. Oh my goodness me! Now you've just exploded so many other questions. Jane, you go. You ask one.
I'm actually getting a little teary-eyed here just thinking about that story you just said. So you had said, I think, at that point your mom moved you. I guess you moved to another city. I think you said, also in Oklahoma.
Yeah.
So
go ahead.
No. So what happened? Like, what was different about the new city? What was it compared to what you had grown up in previously?
Oh no, it was like the same level of poverty. It was just a different environment. And so we moved from a house. So I live in the house now. Like, we moved back. And we're going through gentrification now, so the
Okay.
situation is different. But we moved from this house to a place called Huntington Place Apartments in Midwest City, and so it wasn't necessarily better as far as violence, but the relationships that I had and the influences that I had reset. And that reset was the important part of played a very important role in influencing how I further developed.
Right.
But we didn't there wasn't much of a change in terms of violence. The other apartment right next to us was filled with a lot of young kids who were gang affiliated, not necessarily, but they pretended like they were. And so they would cause unnecessary trouble, like just doing things they didn't know any better. And so they acted the way that they were taught to act. Um, but at Huntington Place, I got a lot of mentors. Detective Coleman, who was, I think I don't know if he's still in the force or not. If he is, I think he's at an administrative position now. But I got a really good relationship with him. I went to a church that my great grandfather used to preach at, and just got a lot of mentors that influenced me, that became my new influences in terms of what I could do.
How did that happen, James? What was that journey? How on earth do you go from where you were to these new influences upon your life?
So I had always been into church. My grandmother was a great influence into that. My great grandfather was still alive up until 2016, and so he was a pastor for 30 years. And so he played a big role in that. I didn't necessarily, it wasn't of importance until I had nothing else to do.
Gotcha.
And so being taken away from my normal just allowed me the space to, okay, what's this thing? And that's kind of, I asked my mom, I want to start going to church. And so we explored a couple different places. The first couple were like mega churches, and I can't learn or really feel anything in those places. And so they took me to New Bethel, which was the church of my great grandfather. I think that was the first church he pastored at. And they just they definitely built my idea of what my value was. Even till this day, they never doubted anything I could do. They believed in me more than I believed in myself.
The seed of brilliance in you.
Seed of brilliance, absolutely. Wow.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No. So, again, I just want to explore this part, if you don't mind. If the question gets too personal, just tell me. So, it's clearly not been a lot of money. How on earth did you manage to transition into Odyssey? Because that's a private school, right?
So actually, that was during the Odyssey, when you go on a shadow, when you go to shadow school, they take you through the experience, they put you in the classes, you talk with the students, teachers, you just have fun. But towards the end of it, they sit you down and you talk about, how you felt, what are your concerns. They talk about what they're looking for, what they see in you, things of that nature. And I was very blunt. This is a private school. I think at the time it was like 8,000 or 6,000 a year, which is very cheap for a private school, to be honest. But I was very blunt. I'm not going to be able to come here. Like, this is $8,000. We wouldn't be able to pay, honestly, 1,500 or 2,000.
Yeah.
So it's like, how's this going to work? Like, it was fun, but it's just not realistic. And they just waived it. They waived my tuition. Even this year, my tuition is completely waived. We also before COVID, we went on trips to different states.
Yes.
And so I think I've paid for 2 trips out of the 8 I've been on. And that was a choice to pay for those trips. But Odyssey has covered my costs.
That's an amazing story.
That's how I've been able to attend Odyssey, is because they've allowed me to.
Wow. Wow. Um, so now, Jane, do you have anything? I've got a couple more I want to.
Well, I've got a lot, but I don't think we can do it all in one interview. But I was going to say, you had mentioned that, at first you were thinking it was okay to die when you reached the age of 18, and you thought a gang life would be an okay, way to live and stuff. And it sounds like from what you're saying, there's lots of kids around you who are still sort of that mindset. And it's like, I know there's no simple solution to that, but like, what do you think? Like, if you could talk to any of these kids, what would you say to them?
I mean, it is hard because I remember the conversations that people try to have with me when I was younger, whether it was family or people who were concerned at my charter school, even people at the church. Because following a mindset like that does come a heavy weight of depression. You, as a young male, I don't know how it is now because I'm just not that age anymore, but there is this thing against any type of emotion. And so you have repressed emotions. You do have depression, even if you don't realize it, or some deep sense of lack of longing, I guess. And so there's a lot of things piled on top of just that mindset. I would say one of the things that helped me was to get into football. And the reason I got into football is because at one point, I think people from the University of Oklahoma put together a camp in my neighborhood, like 20 minutes outside of my neighborhood. And if it wasn't free, I'm pretty sure it cost less than $40 to attend. They had gear for you. There were collegiate athletes in the NFL. And the main theme of it was this brotherhood. You can do anything, especially when you have collective. Bring others up with you. Work as a team to strive to something greater.
Yeah.
And so, as far as what I would say to the people younger than me, it would be one, to let them know that they can't do anything, but two, if I could take them and just put them in front of a lot of different things, whether it's arts, athletics, give them access to the things they didn't have access to begin with. I got access to football and academics just out of opportunity. It wasn't just there for me, and it's not just there for a lot of other people. You don't know those resources exist, even if you are able to technically access them.
Yeah.
And so give them the ability to see the possibilities, I think is an important first step to having that conversation.
It's a great segue into the next part. Are you okay for time, James?
Mm-hmm.
If you don't mind, I think I just want to keep plowing through this because it is so fascinating. So my next thought is this: Can you take us on a journey inside Odyssey with some of the stories of impact and shift that it had on you?
Yeah. So let's see, this is my third year. So I entered Odyssey in 2018, which is crazy to think of looking back. So every year at Odyssey, there's a inaugural Colorado trip. We go to Colorado, to the mountains, to bond. None of our trips, you can't have any form of technology. And so the new students get to kind of incorporate themselves into the community, and you get to just bond with people. I didn't go on my first Colorado trip because I had a heart problem at the time. That isn't a thing anymore. But so I walked into Odyssey without knowing anyone whatsoever or even having a chance to. And so definitely my first few months were watching and observing this new space that I'm not used to. One thing that helped heavily in me just wanting to stay in the first place was my first mentor, Mr. Curo. He was very, very adamant about getting me into the community, and just making me feel welcome in general, someone I could always talk to. And so my first class was that science. It was called SLAM, I believe, Science of Learning and Memory was the acronym. And so that being my first class helped tremendously in me wanting to stay at Odyssey and not being drowned by the fear of um, of being vulnerable.
Mm.
And so first year, or at least first term, Mr. Beckett played a huge impact on me, especially in terms of religion. Mr. Curo was that main pusher to put me into situations where I had to interact with people and build relationships. And then my first trip with Odyssey was going to, I believe it was Virginia. Um, it was Virginia, and we stayed in this little camp far away from civilization. We had a main dining hall, communal area that was about half a mile walk through like this little trail in this little forest area. And at the campsite, we had the dining hall, and then we had 4 different cabins. I think the girls took 2 of them. We took 2 of them. We had about, in my cabin, I believe we had about 12 people. And so that experience alone, having to room with 12 people that I didn't know very well because I didn't put myself out there, and then I wasn't forced to really put myself out there on the Colorado trip. Being in that scenario kind of made it inevitable to build some sort of relationship. I remember on that trip, we on one of the last days, there was a hurricane that was hitting the East Coast, and it split into 4 tornadoes within, I think, 5 miles of our campsite. But we're from Oklahoma, which is Tornado Valley, and so we weren't freaking out. Mind you, the administration, Dr. Martin, people of that nature, Miss Amanda Kingston, they were going crazy because our safety is paramount. But we were just having fun. Like, that was one of the funnest bonding experiences I've ever had, because we were making jokes in the fear of danger, which may or may not be a good thing. But I did build a brotherhood with the people that were in that cabin because of that experience. We had to stay up, obviously, to take any action that was needed. So after that trip, I was really able to not only have a foundation with the mentors that I was close to, but also begin to interact with the students and build a foundation with them. And that kind of continued throughout the entirety of it was my sophomore year, but my first year at Odyssey. Moving on to over the summer, that was the first time that I had ever really interacted or engaged with friends outside of school, because I was very recluse because I was in online school for 7 years. That was that period between leaving my neighborhood and coming back and all that stuff. And so I just hadn't, the people that I could hang out with, it probably wouldn't be the best idea to hang out with prior to this. And so that was definitely a fun experience to learn more about people. I was able to have a lot of deep conversations. And I learned to interweave between having deep conversations and having a fun conversation, and learning that balance within the same breath, which I think is a really important thing for me at this point. Walking into my junior year, I believe there were 5 major deaths in my family from people who were close to me.
Oh, really?
So it was my grandfather on my dad's side, my great grandmother and three of my uncles passed away. Two of those happened at the beginning of the year, and three of them happened within the span of 1 month that
Wow.
following year, the spring semester. And so I was in a very bad place my junior year, and the one thing that I always looked forward to was Odyssey, because past that, I was reminded of a lot of the circumstances going on. Of course, when you have deaths, there's a lot of things that happen within the family as far as emotions, flaring, things of that nature. And so Odyssey was kind of my safe place during that time. I think I talked very little at the time about what was going on. I think the one thing I was very blunt about was the death of my Uncle Junior, but that was about it. And so my junior year, I honestly don't remember much of it because of that situation. I remember the trips very vividly. And so my first trip, we went to DC. And on the DC trip, we got to explore like national monuments, the mall, and then the various museums. On one of the days, I left the school and got to spend a day with my uncle, who lives in DC, works for the federal government. But that trip holds a special place in my heart because I got close to one of my close friends right now, goes to the University of Oklahoma, Ash, and I started to build a relationship with more people outside of the circle that I was kind of surrounded by. One thing I'm happy about with Odyssey is that there are going to be cliques wherever you go. However, they're not as exclusive as other schools may be. And during those trips and really that year in general, I was able to learn how to maneuver through different groups and just to build a relationship overall with people and not get stuck in that clique mindset. By the time the second trip hit, I was able to be friends with a large variety of people. I had a larger net of close friends, and of course, kind of the idea of the in circle, outside circle. But I began to build a network that I could rely on during that trip for sure, with the student base. And during this whole experience, my relationships with the mentors had began to get deeper and deeper.